Hey class, this is Professor Charlie French here with UNH Cooperative Extension and the Carsey School for Public Policy. Today we're going to be talking about Havana, Cuba, and the rise of the urban ag sector, which helped Cuba avert a food crisis that emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. I like to refer to the farmers in Havana's urban ag sector as entrepreneurs because essentially the entire urban agriculture sector didn't even exist until about 1991. As a context to understand the rise of the urban ag sector in Havana, Cuba, it's helpful to understand the urban trends impacting the urban ag sector in the lesser developed world. As you probably all know, that the urban population of the lesser developed countries, what we used to refer to as the third world, has increased many-fold over the past 50 years. Second, up to half of the food that's consumed in developing world cities is produced within city limits. And finally, cities like Kampala, Nairobi, Bangkok, and others actually slash crops that are planted on urban lands, and we know that without guaranteed land tenure, it makes it extremely difficult for farmers to have any sense of security. As a historical context, prior to the Cuban Revolution in the 1950s, almost all of Cuba was planted in sugarcane and other export crops that were owned by giant multinational conglomerate companies in the United States and elsewhere. Just as crops like sugarcane were exported to other countries, so too were the profits from this production. This left a lot of the working class in Cuba marginalized and poor. So it should come as no surprise that the people of Cuba wanted to recapture the ownership of production and the profits that it reaped. But, with the multinational companies refused to negotiate and share the profits, Cuba verged on the brink of revolution by the 1950s. By the late 1950s, Fidel Castro, his brother Raúl, and the Revolutionary Army took over the country and expelled the corporations, thereby taking ownership of all means of production. They soon thereafter developed a system by which the production and the profits from that production would be shared and distributed to the people of Cuba. While this system may have run against the political ideology of the United States, and in fact most of the Western world, it did have its merits. For one, everyone had access to a job and to housing, albeit it wasn't always the quality jobs or the best homes. Second, food rations were provided to meet people's basic needs, although that ration didn't always provide the full need. And lastly, the government provided all critical services to the people, like health care and education. This is not to say that Cuba's economy was vibrant, or that there were economic freedoms, but there was a 30-year period of relative stability in Cuba. It all came to a halt in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Prior to 1991, the Soviet Union was subsidizing Cuban exports, buying Cuba's sugar for above market prices, and selling Cuba oil at below market prices. All in all, Cuba had a pretty good deal in this exchange. To add to Cuba's troubles, the U.S. heightened its embargo on trade in 1996. This exacerbated the poverty that was particularly felt in Cuba's urban areas, like Havana and Santiago. With the loss of Cuba's imports, food security became a huge problem. And with most food production occurring in rural areas, Cuba's cities reached a level of food crisis by late 1991. So, quite uncharacteristically, Fidel Castro set up new policies that allowed groups in the city to organize, to access land, and to sell their surplus food. That sounds a little bit like free market capitalism. Well, agriculture wasn't the only sector that allowed limited free market capitalism to avert the crisis. Here I'm standing with one of the members of the Buena Vista Social Club, world-renowned musicians, who ultimately sold me their CD. And there was also an informal economy, whereby people sold goods to an increasing number of tourists, things like cigars and Cuban rum. What is most impressive about urban ag in Cuba is that there were essentially no urban gardens prior to 1991. But by the mid-1990s, tens of thousands of people were cultivating food in Cuba's cities, accounting for half of Cuba's economic growth during that period. Pictured here is one of Havana's larger urban cooperative farms, which had over 90 members. Each of these members not only had access to food for their household, but they earned 3, 4, and even 5 times what state wages paid. Havana's urban farmers planted a variety of things, from fruits and vegetables to cash crops like coffee pictured here. And they did it, for all intents and purposes, without chemical fertilizers or pesticides, since oil was very expensive. People cultivated in their own yards as well, growing things like medicinals, raising fish and animals. And of course, they planted fruits and vegetables to sustain the family. In fact, a number of types of gardens emerged in Cuba, like rooftop gardens and neighborhood gardens in the inner city, or the community gardens where people from a neighborhood banded together to plant on vacant lots. And just outside of the urban centers, like Havana, Santiago, and Cienfuegos, were the larger organized farms, like the cooperative farm pictured in the upper left, or the modern state farm which provided wages to the farmers and allowed them to keep some of the produce, or the worker gardens that were located on the premises of institutions like hospitals and factories. And finally, there were the parcel and patio gardens that were planted in and around people's homes. As I mentioned before, almost all of the urban production was organic, and the farmers made use of any materials that they could for their production. Literally nothing organic went to waste, and it was all composted. In fact, Cuba's urban farmers used techniques that were developed in the United States but are rarely used here, like the use of California redworms to improve composting, or the use of magnets to polarize the water so that the plants can pick up nutrients. As you can see here, the row on the right is irrigated with polarized water, and it's clear that the plants grow better using a low-cost technology like this. And of course, they use natural pest control, such as the use of intercropping, and the planting of things that repel pests, like marigolds and certain herbs. In many respects, the rise of Cuba's urban agriculture sector and the entrepreneurial activities that surrounded it enabled Cuba's urban residents to avert what could have been an even worse crisis, and it resulted in a whole new, vibrant sector of the economy. However, there are winds of change in Cuba. As the country has slowly opened its doors to tourism and industry, the lands that were once occupied by large cooperative farms has declined sharply, from almost 300 cooperative farms in 1996 to just 44 in 2005. In fact, it's down to just a handful today. At the same time that the cooperative and collective farms are declining, agricultural activity in and around people's homes is on the rise, as exemplified by the rapid increase in patio and parcel gardens, which nearly doubled from 1996 to 2005. In fact, Cuba's government is pushing this transition to make way for hotels and industry on lands once occupied by cooperative farms. So, to summarize, Cuba's urban ag sector grew out of an economic need that resulted from the food crisis after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and Cuba's socialist system emphasized cooperative production of farms. And lastly, as Cuba begins to open up its doors to the outside world and promote industry, it's not clear what will happen to the urban agriculture sector. But one thing is for sure, urban agriculture will always exist in some form in Cuba. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you learned something about Cuba's urban ag sector. See you next year.